To comprehend the absolute supremacy of humanity among the stars is to gaze into the heart of a god engine. It is the perfection of the Omnissiah made manifest in iron and adamantium. Long before the darkness of betrayal tore our galaxy asunder, the priesthood of the Adeptus Mechanicus sought to forge the ultimate instrument of destruction. Driven by equal measures of fanatical religious fervor and cold, unyielding logic, they envisioned an engine of war that defied the very laws of reality. To call an Imperator-class Titan a mere war machine is a heresy born of profound ignorance. It is a walking cathedral, a towering monument of Gothic supremacy that blots out the sun and carries the unbridled wrath of the master of mankind upon its armored shoulders. The sheer logistical impossibility of its construction beggars human comprehension. Entire continents are strip-mined of their deepest mineral wealth just to cast the skeletal framework of a single-leg actuator. Generations of indentured laborers are worked to dust, and whole planetary economies are permanently exhausted simply to build the colossal plasma reactor that beats within its chest. Even before those primordial drives ignite, the presence of an Imperator shatters the minds of lesser beings. Simply standing perfectly still upon the muster fields, it exudes a suffocating aura of psychological terror. Its shadow alone is a physical weight that brings defiant planetary governors weeping to their knees in absolute despair. The massive bells tolling from its shoulder-mounted spires ring out across the silent plains as a death knell for entire civilizations, promising total annihilation to any who would deny the imperial truth. To properly grasp its divine stature, one must understand the sacred hierarchy of the machine god. The swift scout engines of the Warhound class hunt the front lines like ravenous packs of metallic wolves. The versatile battle titans of the Reaver class shatter enemy fortifications with brutal, relentless bombardments. The mighty Warlord-class engines tower above them as the true lords of the battlefield, capable of leveling sprawling hive cities with a single apocalyptic salvo. Yet the Imperator stands entirely apart from this lineage of devastation. It is never classified as a mere vehicle, for it is recognized by the priesthood as a literal, living avatar of the divine. It is a fully consecrated shrine that strides across the ashes of shattered worlds, housing thousands of tech priests, Skitarii, and servitors within the fortified bastions of its legs. Every rivet struck into its thick carapace is an act of desperate prayer, and every cannon blast is a deafening sermon of pure annihilation. Yet among these walking gods of steel and wrath, there are those whose terrifying legends eclipse even the majesty of their peers. The absolute culmination of this sacred science did not occur in the void, but deep within the sanctified forged temples of the Mechanicum homeworld. Through centuries of relentless toil and bloody sacrifice, the red sands of Mars bore witness to the gestation of a singularly terrifying entity. The fires of the greatest macro-forges burned with a blinding brilliance unseen since the dark days of the age of technology, as the exalted Archmagi prepared to lay the keel of an immortal nightmare. Deep beneath the rust-choked skies of the Red Planet, a new deity of iron was hammered into existence. The sprawling macro-forges of Mars echoed with the ceaseless pounding of immense trip hammers as the adamantium bones of the Dies Irae were laid down in pristine. Gleaming and unblemished, its colossal chassis stood in stark contrast to the grim, blood-soaked future it was destined to endure. This immaculate cathedral of metal was free from the scars of orbital bombardments, untouched by the grime of 1,000 ruined worlds, and completely ignorant of the horrors that lay hidden within the darkest corners of the galaxy. Yet the priests of the Mechanicum did not build monuments to peace, they forged avatars of absolute annihilation. The awakening of an Imperator Titan is not a simple mechanical activation, but a sacred and terrifying resurrection. Tens of thousands of crimson-robed tech priests gathered upon the abyssal gantries surrounding the newborn Titan, their augmented voices raised in a deafening Binharic chant that shook the very foundations of the forge. Enormous cranes swung sensors the size of drop pods through the superheated air, wreathing the god engine in thick clouds of holy incense. Master artificers painstakingly anointed its gargantuan knee joints and apocalyptic weapon mounts with the rarest sanctified oils. They etched the liturgies of iron into every blessed rivet and ceramite plate, binding the physical form to the divine will of the Omnissiah. Then came the moment of ultimate communion. The Archmagi ordered the ignition of its primary plasma reactor. As a captive sun roared to life within its cavernous chest, the Dies Irae did not merely power up. It drew its first terrible breath. At that precise fraction of a second, the Animus Omnissiah fully manifested within its adamantium shell. To comprehend a Titan is to understand the terrifying reality of the machine spirit. The motive force that dwells within these towering constructs is no mere compilation of lifeless cogitator algorithms. It is a vast, predatory consciousness born of ancient archaeotech and accumulated malice. The soul of an Imperator Titan is so impossibly dense, so fundamentally wrathful, that it requires a human princeps of unparalleled willpower simply to survive the neural bridge. A weak mind, attempting to interface with the manifold of such a god engine, would be instantly shattered. Their sanity would be incinerated by the sheer arrogance and aggression radiating from the machine's core. The Dies Irae possessed a spirit far more violent than its peers. From the instant its reactor flooded its massive arterial cables with plasma fire, its consciousness screamed a challenge into the Martian noosphere. It was born hungry for war. It was a pure, devastating sentience, entirely untouched by the corrupting whispers of chaos, yet completely consumed by the desire to destroy. Its void shields crackled with latent aggressive energy, and its immense targeting cogitators violently processed firing solutions for enemies that did not yet exist. This was a newborn deity forged in the Martian Cradle, a weapon of unparalleled devastation demanding a galaxy to conquer. But a god of war cannot walk the stars alone. Such magnificent wrath requires focus, and such a grand engine requires a pantheon to serve. The Lords of Mars recognized the boundless, simmering violence within the Dies Irae. They knew this peerless engine could not be entrusted to a passive brotherhood. It had to be bound to a Titan legion whose reputation for unyielding brutality could match the fury of the engine itself. To harness such a tempest of wrath, a vessel of iron requires masters forged in the same merciless crucible. The newly awakened Dies Irae did not wake to serve mere soldiers. It was claimed by the Death's Heads, the dreaded Legio Mortis. Born in the poisoned rad wastes of Mars during the darkest, bloodiest centuries of the Age of Strife, this Titan Legion was never meant to be a force of liberation. They were birthed as exterminators, designed to crush the mutant warlords and techno-heretics that plagued the Red Planet before the coming of the Emperor. Where other legions sought to conquer and integrate new worlds into the Imperial fold, the Legio Mortis sought only absolute grinding erasure. They were executioners in the truest sense. They were walking avatars of annihilation, soon to be clad in stark black armor and trimmed with burnished gold. To see their sable heraldry break the horizon was to know that compliance was no longer an option. Only ashes and shattered bedrock would remain in their wake. This ruthless, uncompromising doctrine cultivated a culture of supreme arrogance within their ranks. The princeps and Moderati of the Death's Heads viewed themselves not as humble servants of a nascent imperium, but as living gods of war standing high above the petty squabbles of mortals. Yet even arrogant gods will bow to a greater will if it promises them endless ruin. During the fiery dawn of the Great Crusade, a blood brotherhood was forged that would ultimately shatter the galaxy. The Legio Mortis marched alongside the Lunar Wolves, the unparalleled Space Marine Legion commanded by the Warmaster Horus. In the crucible of early, brutal compliance campaigns, these two titanic forces found a dark and lasting kinship. Horus understood the sinister heart of the Legio Mortis better than the distant bureaucrats and Lords of Terra ever could. He did not leash them or preach restraint. Instead, He unleashed them fully, praised their utter devastation, and rewarded their wholesale butchery with unmatched martial glory. Through decades of shared slaughter across the stars, the Titan Legion's loyalty subtly but irreversibly shifted. Their oaths of allegiance to the distant emperor sitting upon Terra became hollow, ceremonial words spoken only out of dying habit. Their true devotion belonged solely to the Warmaster who stood beside them in the blood-soaked mud of 1,000 ruined worlds. The Dies Irae, now the crowning jewel of this arrogant brotherhood, was a perfect reflection of its master's pride. It was an unholy monument to the unrivaled supremacy of Horus and the absolute destruction the Legio Mortis promised to deliver unto his enemies. Its black and gold armor plating was a testament to a legion that recognized no authority but the Warmaster. But a metal god, no matter how vast or wrathful, is nothing without a soul to direct its fury. The roaring plasma reactor and the fiercely hostile machine spirit demanded physical union. The immense god engine now waited in the dark for the fragile mortal minds necessary to command its apocalyptic power. To command a god of iron is not a privilege, it is a prolonged and agonizing sacrifice. Within the armored skull of the Dies Irae lies the command deck, a shadowed cathedral of humming cogitators and incense-choked air. Here, mere mortals strive to direct the wrath of an immortal machine. The hierarchy of the bridge is absolute, a delicate web of flesh and data woven around a single mind. Below the central dais sit the Moderati, the sub-commanders who manage the Titan's localized systems and weapons. Flanking them are the steersman, who translates neural imperatives into the thunderous stride of mechanical legs, and the sensori, who drowns in a ceaseless tide of auspex sweeps and targeting data. Yet they are but the peripheral nerves of this colossal entity. The true soul of the Titan resides within the command throne, sealed inside an armored amniotic tank. Here floats the Princeps, suspended in a nutrient-rich, alchemically treated fluid that preserves their rapidly atrophying physical body. They are connected to the God engine through the Mind Impulse Unit, a brutally invasive network of spinal jacks and cranial shunts. The mechanics of the MIU defy the natural limits of the mortal mind. It forcibly shatters the boundaries of human perception, expanding a single consciousness to envelop the entirety of the Imperator Titan. When the connection is made, the Princeps no longer breathes the recycled air of the command deck. Instead, they feel the roaring furnace of the plasma reactor as their own beating heart. They perceive the flickering energies of the void shields as a second skin, prickling with static and cosmic radiation. Radar arrays and picked thieves become their eyes, stretching their vision across dozens of kilometers in every direction. This artificial apotheosis comes at a devastating cost. The sensory overload is a crushing weight that would instantly obliterate the sanity of an unconditioned mind. The Princeps must simultaneously process the flow of superheated coolant, the alignment of macro-cannon shell chambers, and the localized atmospheric disruptions caused by their own colossal mass. Every step the Titan takes reverberates through the pilot's nervous system. Every solid blow struck against the adamantium hull registers as a phantom agony in mortal flesh. Psychologically, it is a constant war of dominance. The machine spirit of an imperator is a vast, ancient, and bellicose intelligence. The Princeps must possess a will of iron to subjugate this metal beast, lest their own fragile identity be consumed and reduced to a mere spark in the engine's eternal fire. Generations of Legio Mortis masters have sacrificed their humanity to the MIU, dissolving into the machine until they could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the hum of the manifold. The Dies Irae demands the strongest of souls to endure its crushing embrace. It requires men who are as ruthless and unyielding as the iron they command. Within the amniotic depths of this legendary war engine, a new consciousness has taken the reins. Destiny now turns its gaze upon the specific mortals chosen to bind their minds to this apocalyptic avatar, the very men who will steer the Dies Irae away from the light of terror and into the darkest abyss of treason. To survive the sensory crucifixion of the manifold, a single human mind is woefully insufficient. The command deck of an Imperator-Titan requires a triumvirate of souls, bound together in an intense psychic and emotional symbiosis. Through the merciless umbilical of the mind impulse unit, three distinct consciousnesses are fused into a single, multifaceted overmind. They share every surge of reactor heat, every phantom pain of shattered armor, and every fleeting thought that crosses their tethered synapses. Within the armored skull of the Dies Irae, this immense cognitive burden fell upon a trinity of vastly different men. At the apex of this mental pyramid sat Princeps Esau Turnet. Turnet was a man forged from the brutal ethos of the Legio Mortis. He was iron-willed, ruthless, and entirely devoted to the martial supremacy of his Titan legion. To look upon Turnet was to see a predator perfectly adapted to the apex of the Great Crusade. He did not merely pilot the Dies Irae, he dominated its belligerent machine spirit through sheer, tyrannical willpower. Yet even a mind as formidable as his required anchors to keep from being consumed by the colossal wrath of the engine. His primary anchor was Moderati Secundus Jonah Aruken. Aruken was a creature of naked ambition and rampant hedonism. He viewed the monumental destruction wrought by the Titan not with solemn reverence, but as a bloody stepping stone toward personal glory and promotion. He craved the privileges of command and the intoxicating thrill of absolute power. Aruken managed the primary weapon systems and tactical auspex, his greedy, calculating mind perfectly suited to identifying the weaknesses of their enemies. Balancing Aruken's self-serving nature was the Moderati Primus, Titus Cassar. Cassar was a quiet, contemplative soul, deeply principled and resolute in his duties. He governed the defensive shields and locomotion of the titanic war machine, serving as the steadying heartbeat of the trio. But beneath his disciplined exterior, Cassar harbored a highly dangerous secret. In an era of mandated imperial truth and secular compliance, Cassar secretly held faith in the divinity of the master of mankind. This forbidden belief, the seed of the Lectitio Divinitatus, whispered only in the darkest shadows, fueled his quiet endurance. Individually, these three mortals were a volatile mixture of tyranny, greed, and forbidden zeal. They were a fundamentally flawed assembly of humanity, walking a razor edge of psychological collapse. Yet when the manifold cables were driven into their flesh, these mortal flaws dissolved into a terrifying unified perfection. Turnet provided the unstoppable drive, Aruken the lethal pragmatism, and Cassar the unwavering defensive foundation. Together, their minds formed a flawless, seamless architecture of mass destruction. They became a singular entity, breathing life into the most powerful weapon ever constructed by human hands. United in blood and iron, this triumvirate prepared to lead the Dies Irae toward the absolute zenith of imperial conquest, marching into a golden age where the stars themselves would tremble before their unified wrath. The dust of 1,000 slaughtered worlds settled at last upon the plains of Ullanor. The greatest greenskin empire the galaxy had ever known lay broken in the dirt, the brutal reign of the Orc overlord shattered by the unified might of the legions Astartes. It was the crowning achievement of the Great Crusade, the moment where the manifest destiny of humanity seemed absolute and unassailable. Across the vast, flattened continents of the conquered world, millions of legionaries, mortal soldiers, and towering war machines gathered in an ocean of martial splendor. At the very heart of this unimaginably grand assembly stood the Dies Irae. It was a literal mountain of gunmetal and gold, casting a colossal shadow that stretched across the triumphant legions. Within its vaulted command decks, the crew reveled in the ultimate euphoria of imperial victory. They had fought, they had bled, and now they stood as revered gods of war at the side of the master of mankind. To mark the commencement of the triumph, the Dies Irae raised its devastating armament to the heavens. The mighty Titan fired its massive weapons in a deafening, continuous salute. The sheer concussive force of the volley tore through the clouds and shook the very atmosphere of Ullanor to its bedrock. It was a roar of absolute supremacy, a sound that declared the stars belonged to humanity alone. Beneath this titanic canopy of thunder, the Emperor of Mankind stood shoulder to shoulder with his most favoured son, Horus Lupercal. We chroniclers look back upon this golden memory and weep, for the tragic irony of Ullanor is written in the blood of everything that followed. This was the absolute zenith of human achievement. It was the shining, flawless pinnacle before the great descent into eternal madness. Never again would the Imperium be so united, so pure in its purpose, or so invincible in its staggering might. Yet within this blinding light of total victory, the longest and darkest shadows were being cast. Upon that grand pavilion, beneath the gaze of the god machine, the Emperor made a proclamation that would seal the doom of the galaxy. He bestowed the exalted title of Warmaster upon Horus, granting him supreme, unquestioned command over all the military forces of the Imperium. Then came the fatal decision, delivered not with an enemy blade, but with a creator's departure. The Emperor announced that his time among the stars was finished and that he was leaving the Great Crusade to return to the Throneworld of Terra. He intended to labour in secret upon unseen machinations, leaving his sons to finish the conquest of the galaxy without his guiding light. He offered no true explanation for his sudden absence. As the Dies Irae towered over the cheering billions, basking in the afterglow of its mighty salute, the first invisible seeds of resentment were planted in the hearts of the demigods below. The intoxicating heights of adulation began to ferment into a slow, insidious rot of pride. The mortal crew of the great Titan, much like the new Warmaster they now served, believed they had permanently conquered the cosmos. They were entirely unaware that the most devastating war in human history was already germinating in the quiet, bitter silence their emperor left behind. The triumph of Ullanor was a hollow summit. Beneath the golden veneer of the Great Crusade, microscopic fractures began to spread through the secular bedrock of the Imperium. Within the sprawling armoured bellies of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, the shadows lengthened. Here, far from the blinding light of terror, mortal men sought solace in the forbidden. Consider Titus Cassar, a dutiful Moderati of the Legio Mortis. By cycle, he walked within the mind of a literal god of iron and fury. He piloted the awe-inspiring Dies Irae, an Imperator-class Titan that shattered entire cities with its mechanized wrath. This was a tangible, worldly deity, a towering engine of destruction worshipped by the tech priests of Mars with sacred unguents and binary cant. Yet the human soul of Moderati Cassar starved in the cold, unfeeling presence of the machine. He sought a higher communion, a warmth that plasteel and plasma could never provide. In the quiet dark of his cramped quarters, Cassar turned to a secret truth that defied the very laws of the Great Crusade. He pressed his forehead to the hidden, illicit parchment of a banned text known as the Lectitio Divinitatus. He did not pray to the screaming steel behemoth he commanded, but to the invisible spiritual majesty of the Master of Mankind. Cassar worshipped the Emperor of Mankind as a true, infallible god. To hold such a belief in this era was to court summary execution. The imperial truth was absolute in its ruthless rejection of the divine. It demanded a universe governed only by cold reason, science, and secular enlightenment. To whisper a genuine prayer was considered an act of treason against the emperor himself. Cassar lived a dangerous double life, a devout man trapped in a military machine that outlawed the existence of the soul. History is a tapestry woven with bitter, blood-stained ironies. The holy text that Cassar clutched to his chest in the dark was not born of righteous saints or enlightened martyrs. The Lectitio Divinitatus was originally penned by the hand of a primarch. It was Lorgar Aurelian who first committed the undeniable divinity of the emperor to the page. Long before the fires of heresy consumed the galaxy, the Urizen sought to elevate his immortal father to the heavens. For this profound devotion, Lorgar was violently rebuked, humiliated in the ashes of Monarchia, and ultimately cast into the waiting arms of the ruinous powers. Thus, the foundational creed of what would eventually become the vast, unyielding Adeptus Ministorum was authored by the foremost arch-traitor of the Imperium. The holiest words of the distant future were written in the damning ink of profound betrayal. Cassar knew nothing of the dark, tragic origins of his newfound faith. He only knew the profound comfort it brought him amidst the endless, grinding slaughter of the Crusade. He whispered his desperate devotions in terrified isolation, unaware that he was not the only soul harboring dangerous secrets in the void. His solitary worship perfectly mirrored a deeper, much darker fragmentation, taking hold across the vast armada of the expeditionary fleet. While Cassar knelt in secret reverence to a god of light, other men gathered in hidden chambers and dimly lit cargo holds. Clandestine warrior fraternities and secret lodges were rapidly taking root in the absolute silence of the warships. The unshakable secular unity of the mighty legions was silently unraveling in the dark. Every hidden meeting and whispered prayer pulled the Crusaders further away from the strict light of rational truth. The mighty foundations of imperial loyalty were silently turning to dust, leaving empty spaces in the hearts of men waiting to be filled by things older and fouler than the stars. While Titus Cassar knelt in the solitary silence of his illicit faith, his brothers within the Legio Mortis were forging a very different kind of communion. Deep within the armoured bellies of the expeditionary fleet vessels, away from the watchful optical sensors of the ruling Magi, a shadow society had taken root. They were known as the Warrior Lodges. To understand the insidious nature of these gatherings, one must first understand the iron rigidity of the Mechanicum. On Mars, existence is defined by unyielding hierarchy, where absolute obedience is owed to superiors by divine binary mandate. Yet inside the sealed chambers of the lodges, the unimaginable occurred. Rank was discarded at the threshold. Princeps, Moderati, and engineer alike donned the same simple hoods, passing heavy silver medallions from hand to hand in the dim light. They sat as equals in the dark, speaking freely of their fears, their triumphs, and their grievances. For Princeps Esor Turnet, the lodge was an instrument of profound control, masked as fraternity. He used the shadowed meetings to bind his crew to him, not by doctrinal mandate, but by the potent illusion of egalitarian brotherhood. Moderati Jonah Aruken eagerly embraced this clandestine fellowship, finding within it the warmth of camaraderie and the promise of advancement that the cold logic of the priesthood denied him. Through the sharing of illicit wine and whispered oaths, their allegiances slowly realigned. They ceased to be servants of the distant emperor or the Mechanicum. They became men of the Warmaster. Yet Titus Cassar was glaringly absent from these smoky chambers. His soul was already anchored to the Lectitio Divinitatus, leaving him isolated from the growing fraternity of the lodge. Cassar viewed their rituals with quiet disdain, oblivious to the fact that his exclusion from their brotherhood marked him as an outsider among his own crew. This separation was entirely by design, for the true architects of the warrior lodges required vessels primed for infection. The origins of these secret fraternities trace back to the feral world of Davin. It was there that the word-bearers, guided by the treacherous hand of First Chaplain Ebus, learned the methods of the Serpent Lodge. The word-bearers recognized the potent psychological weapon a secret society represented. They systematically seeded these lodges throughout the expeditionary fleets, presenting them as harmless traditions of martial bonding. In truth, they were vectors for ideological corruption, designed to bypass the formal chain of command and erode the foundational loyalties of the imperial forces. Within the egalitarian dark of the lodge, whispers of resentment against the distant emperor were nurtured into fervent devotion to Horus. The lodges created an echo chamber where rebellion could be normalized under the guise of brotherly truth. Turnit and Aruken were irrevocably drawn into this web, their souls bound to the Warmaster through blood oaths sworn in the dark. The ideological wedges had been driven deep into the heart of the Legio Mortis. The crew of the Dies Irae was now divided by invisible lines of faith and shadowed brotherhood, waiting only for the final bloody catalyst to ignite the flames of absolute treason. Above the stagnant swamps of Davin, a suffocating terror gripped the greatest armada ever assembled. The unthinkable had come to pass. Warmaster Horus, the brightest star of the Great Crusade, had been brought low by an assassin blade. To understand the crippling weight of this moment is to understand the fragile psychology of the expeditionary fleets. A Primarch is not merely a general to his soldiers, he is the spiritual anchor of their entire existence. When such a demigod is imperiled, the very fabric of military discipline unravels into primitive terror. Panic is a sickening and xenos emotion to the transhuman space marine, yet it bled through the ranks like a virulent contagion. Mortal crews abandoned their stations, driven utterly mad by the psychic backwash of thousands of grieving warriors. The vast vox channels of the fleet descended into anarchic screaming. The ordered hierarchy of the Imperium shattered under the sudden, crushing weight of impending orphanhood. Nowhere was this absolute dread more palpable than upon the command deck of the Dies Irae. Princeps Turnit and his Moderati sat entombed within the cold silence of their god engine. They were physically severed from the frantic events on the surface, yet intimately chained to the unfolding tragedy. Raging paranoia stalked the shadowed bridge of the Titan. Crew members exchanged poisoned glances, their hands hovering over sidearms as the dark whispers of the warrior lodges echoed in the gloom. They demanded to know who was to blame for this failure. They openly questioned why the Emperor was absent in this darkest hour. They wondered why Terra had abandoned her greatest son to rot on a forgotten feral moon. The terrible anathema of doubt took root in the fertile soil of their shared despair. Then came the fateful decision to surrender the dying Warmaster to the local priests of the Serpent Lodge. For days, the vast fleet hung suspended in an agonizing, silent purgatory. The recycled air within the Dies Irae grew thick and foul, mirroring the rotting atmosphere of the swamp world below. Ancient oaths of loyalty to the distant Throneworld were quietly forgotten in the dark. They were replaced by desperate, whispered prayers to whatever hidden powers might restore their beloved commander. When the command network finally flared to life with the news of the Warmaster's miraculous recovery, the resulting relief was deafening. However, it was not the wholesome joy of loyal soldiers. It was a fevered, unnatural ecstasy that bordered on mass hysteria. When Horus finally returned to the fleet, the atmosphere aboard the Dies Irae shifted from crippling dread to a fanatical devotion. The men and women of the Legio Mortis wept tears of profound obsession and swore new oaths that defied all imperial law. The Titan crews no longer belonged to the distant Emperor. They no longer served the fading light of terror. Their mortal souls had been forged anew in the unseen fires of Davin, bound eternally and completely to the spiritual corruption of the engine crews was now absolute, sealed in unspoken pacts and rabid fanaticism. With the most destructive elements of the fleet radicalized and the final tethers to humanity severed, the Warmaster turned his burning gaze outward. The great snare was finally primed. The fleet ignited its plasma drives, setting a direct course for the doomed system of The Warmaster brought his armada to the Isstvan system not as a conqueror, but as an executioner. The choral city of Isstvan III had risen in rebellion against the imperial truth, a petty defiance that demanded swift compliance. Or so the narrative was spun. From the vast launch bays of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, drop pods and storm birds rained upon the world below in a magnificent tempest of steel. Within those descending vessels rode the finest warriors of the Imperium. The loyalist elements of the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters were hurled into the meat grinder of an urban pacification campaign. They went eagerly, their hearts full of devotion for a Warmaster who had already condemned them to die. They did not know they were descending into a meticulously crafted abattoir. High above the dying city, aboard the gargantuan transport vessels of Legio Mortis, the god machines waited. The mightiest of them all, the Imperator Titan Dies Irae, sat entombed within its colossal dropkeep. Its plasma reactor hummed with a caged, thrumming fury, idling in the cold dark of the orbital. Princeps Aesor Turnet commanded his crew with a rigid, unnatural tension. He issued strict, prohibitive orders to seal the command decks and lock down the Moderati to their crash couch. They were told to prepare for a catastrophic environmental hazard, yet the Titan remained stubbornly rooted to the Earth. No AWS-PEX data was shared with the lower tiers of the crew. No tactical readouts were broadcast from the bridge. They were held in total ignorance, blind and tethered, while the loyalist battle raged across the crust of the world around them. To hold an Imperator Titan in reserve during a planetary assault defied all established doctrines of the Collegia Titanica. The deployment of a god machine of such staggering mass is a logistical leviathan. It requires the coordinated effort of thousands of tech thralls, the recalibration of atmospheric dampeners, and the agonizingly slow descent of a specialized mass conveyor. Once an Imperator is awakened for war, it is unleashed as the vanguard of annihilation, meant to shatter enemy morale the moment its shadow falls upon the Earth. To spin up the plasma heart of the Dies Irae, to arm its apocalyptic weaponry, and then deliberately hold it back in absolute lockdown, was an anomaly that bordered on madness. It spoke of a hidden agenda, a tactical subversion that went entirely unnoticed by the zealous Astartes bleeding in the streets of the Choral city. Down on the surface, the loyalists carved through the rebel defenses with the brutally efficient heroism that had forged a galaxy-spanning empire. They looked to the skies, expecting the familiar thunderous arrival of reinforcements or the screaming descent of their Titan allies. Instead, the void above them grew ominously still. The Armada held its position in the upper atmosphere, watching the loyal suns bleed in the dirt. The silence of the fleet was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pause that blanketed the doomed world. It was a silence that would only be broken by the deployment of the most horrific weapon ever conceived by human minds. The betrayal descends upon Isstvan III, not with the roar of conventional ordnance, but in the silent, falling arcs of virus bombs. Within the sealed, heavily shielded command deck of the Imperator Titan Dies Irae, the sensorium registers a sudden, sickening bloom of atmospheric. The payload deployed by the Warmaster is the Life Eater virus, a biological weapon of such absolute malice that its use was once strictly curtailed by the Emperor himself. As the heavy orbital munitions shatter against the planetary surface, the telemetry pouring into the command deck begins a catastrophic exponential climb. The Life Eater is a hyper-aggressive, necrotizing pathogen designed to consume organic matter at a cellular level. It rapidly breaks down flesh, bone, and flora into a putrescent, liquid state, multiplying instantly as it feeds upon the genetic foundations of its victims. It is a weapon of absolute exterminatus, indiscriminately devouring everything that draws breath. Billions of life signs, meticulously tracked by the cogitators of the mighty Titan, begin to extinguish in a matter of seconds. The sweeping green runic displays of the Auspex transform into a sea of cascading red failures as the pathogen consumes the civilian population and the betrayed loyalist Astartes alike. Princeps Turnet sits within the amniotic command tank, his face an immovable mask of cold calculation as he absorbs the apocalyptic data flow. He watches the casualty counters spin into infinity without a single tremor of regret, assessing the destruction merely as the successful execution of an optimal tactical strike. Beside him, Moderati Titus Cassar stares at the sweeping readouts, his mind fracturing under the weight of a dawning horror. These are no Xenos targets fading from the tactical displays, but the very brothers they had deployed to the surface under false pretenses. Cassar listens to the Vox channels dissolve into wet, agonizing screams before going dead, his soul recoiling as he realizes the unforgivable sin being committed by his own commanders. As the Life-Eater virus accelerates across the continents, it triggers a catastrophic secondary effect upon the planetary biosphere. The unimaginably massive volume of decaying organic matter releases immense clouds of highly unstable, volatile necrogas. The atmosphere of Isstvan III thickens into a highly flammable sludge, saturating the air with extreme explosive potential. The cogitators chime a final mechanized warning just before a blinding orbital lance strike from the Warmaster's flagship deliberately ignites the corrupted heavens. A global firestorm erupts with the fury of a dying star, sweeping across the world in a tidal wave of thermonuclear heat that scours the bedrock clean of the viral taint and the ashes of the betrayed. The sheer magnitude of the flash temporarily blinds the Titan sensor banks, leaving a terrible ringing silence upon the command deck. Cassar tears his eyes from the blackened monitors, his faith in the Crusade utterly shattered. The absolute totality of the planetary massacre leaves no room for denial, and the realization of his complicity ignites a sudden spark of mutinous rage within his heart. The firestorm outside has only just consumed a world, but the inferno of treachery is about to breach the sanctum of the Dies Irae. The flesh is consumed and the truth is laid bare in the toxic ashes of Isstvan III. The virus bombs have fallen, weeping death across a world that once basked in the Emperor's light. Billions are dead, and the loyal sons of the legions have been condemned to rot. Aboard the command deck of the Dies Irae, the sheer magnitude of this atrocity crashes over Moderati Cassar. The scales fall from his eyes, replaced by the horrifying clarity of ultimate betrayal. He is standing in the belly of a god, yet the men beside him have thrown their souls to the darkest abyss. Cassar acts. He draws his sidearm, the metallic slide of the weapon echoing across the vastness of the bridge. This is no cramped cockpit, but a sprawling, vaulted cathedral of war. So immense is the skull of an Imperator Titan that an entire infantry skirmish could rage across its tiered platforms and polished brass decking without ever scratching the sacred alcove. Cassar levels his weapon, aiming the barrel down the length of this mechanical sanctuary toward the central command throne. There, suspended in a pressurized tank of amniotic fluid, floats Princeps Turnit. The master of the Dies Irae does not flinch. Turnit remains utterly motionless, his physical shell submerged while his mind drifts through the limitless ocean of the Titan's manifold. Through the heavy cables of his mind impulse unit, Turnit is one with the God Machine, feeling the heat of its plasma reactor and the weight of its void shields. A mortal handgun is less than a stinging insect to a man who commands the power to level continents. Turnit is calm, radiating the absolute certainty of the arch-traitor Horus. Yet the cold steel in Cassar's hand speaks to the undeniable authority of the God Emperor. It is a standoff of ideologies playing out in the nerve center of an apocalyptic engine. Cassar knows that to kill the Princeps in his integration tank is to risk crippling the Titan, but heresy cannot be allowed to fester. His finger tightens on the trigger, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. But the mutineer is not alone on the command deck. To his flank stands Moderati Jonah Aruken, a man whose ambition has always wrestled with his oaths. Cassar turns his desperate gaze toward his brother in arms. He appeals to Aruken, begging him to see the madness of this slaughter. He invokes the sacred duty they swore to Terra, the honor of the Legio Mortis, and the eternal damnation that awaits oathbreakers. The air grows impossibly heavy, suffocating under the weight of a monumental decision. The fate of the most powerful war engine in the Imperium no longer rests on grand strategies or planetary bombardments. It balances entirely upon the conscience of a single flawed mortal. Aruken stares at the drawn pistol, then up to the godlike detachment of his Princeps. He reaches for his own weapon, his hands trembling as the silence of the command deck stretches into eternity. The air within the command deck of the Dies Irae grew thick with the metallic scent of sweat and impending violence. Cassar stood defiant, his weapon levelled at Turnit, the very soul of the god machine hanging in the balance of a mortal standoff. It was in this suffocating silence that Jonah Aruken found himself staring into the abyss of his own soul. He was no fanatic, he was no worshipper of dark powers or student of forbidden truths. Jonah Aruken was simply a man consumed by the most ordinary and devastating of human flaws. He possessed a raw, naked ambition. To look upon the command throne of the Emperor-Titan was to look upon his ultimate desire. He did not want to burn the galaxy, he merely wanted to rule this one titanic fraction of it. The ruinous powers are often depicted as conquerors who batter down the walls of reality with demonic brute force. Yet the darkest secret kept within the sealed vaults of the Black Library is far more tragic. Chaos rarely needs to force entry into the hearts of humanity. It is invited inside. The grandest atrocities of our blood-soaked history are seldom born from grand cosmic malice. They are born from mundane, petty selfishness. A single man desiring a promotion, a captain coveting a better ship, a Moderati dreaming of the princeps throne. Human ambition is the greatest gateway for the warp. It is the quiet, desperate whisper of pride that unbars the gates of hell and welcomes the nightmare in. For Jonah Aruken, the choice was not between the Emperor and the Warmaster. The choice was between dying a loyal subordinate or living to one day command the Dies Irae himself. His hand trembled only for a fraction of a heartbeat. Then the thunder of a discharging weapon shattered the tension on the bridge. It was not Turnit who fell. Aruken fired upon his brother in arms, his shot catching Cassar and tearing through his flesh. The mutiny was broken in a single treacherous instant. Through the haze of pain and the sudden realization of absolute betrayal, Cassar staggered backward. Bleeding and broken, the loyalist staggered backward, his hands frantically clutching his ruined flesh. Refusing to perish upon the defiled deck of the traitor engine, Cassar hurled himself into the shadowed egress corridors, fleeing the command sanctum to cast his lot with the doomed martyrs below. Aruken lowered his weapon, sealing his own damnation not with a dark oath, but with a silent, shameful breath. Turnit stood victorious, his authority over the command deck absolute and unchallenged. The bridge of the Dies Irae was now entirely aligned with the Warmaster Horus. There were no more dissenting voices, no more loyalist prayers to stay their wrath. The titanic war engine stood fully subjugated to the will of the traitors, a magnificent instrument of divine wrath, handed over to the architects of... Below them, the ruined plains of Isstvan III still burned, littered with the staggering remnants of the loyalist legions who had survived the viral firestorm. With internal disputes settled and the chain of command unified in heresy, Turnit turned his gaze to the viewing ports. The time for hesitation had passed, and the order was given to unleash the apocalyptic fury of the Dies Irae upon those who still drew breath in the ashes. The orbital purge was complete, leaving the command deck slick with the blood of the faithful. Now, the Dies Irae plummeted toward the murdered world of Isstvan III. The sky was a suffocating shroud of black ash and radioactive storm clouds, scarred by the lingering heat of the Life-Eater virus. To deploy an Imperator-Titan from orbit is an act of planetary trauma. It requires the deployment of monumental dropkeeps, towering fortress landers designed with singular, brutal purpose. These colossal craft-house counter-gravitic generators of ancient, barely understood design. They must arrest the descent of a war engine weighing tens of thousands of tons. The gravitational engineering strains the very fabric of local space, forcing the physical laws of the universe to bend. Invisible tethers of suspensor webbing scream against the immense mass of adamantium and plasteel. Without this arcane technology, the Dies Irae would strike the surface with the catastrophic force of an extinction-level meteor. Instead, the great dropkeep blazed through the blackened atmosphere like a falling star, burning away the toxic clouds of the orbital bombardment. Retro-rockets ignited in the final atmospheric layer, bathing the ruined cities below in searing, unholy light. The landing was not a gentle arrival, but a localized cataclysm. The vast deployment craft slammed into the crust of Isstvan III, shattering miles of glassed earth into razor-sharp fragments. Massive hydraulic ramps plunged downward, crushing the pulverized rock beneath their weight. From the boiling fog of war and chemical displacement, a nightmare of iron and brass emerged. The Dies Irae stepped onto the broken world. Its first footfall struck with the terrifying weight of an angry god. The impact sent violent shockwaves rolling through the ruined skeletal masonry of the Choral city. Tectonic plates groaned under the unprecedented pressure of its gargantuan tread. Deep within the corpse-choked rubble, the betrayed survivors of the Legions Astartes clung to existence. Loyalist warriors like Garviel Loken and Tarik Torgadan tasted the bitter, oily ash of their dying world. They felt the rhythmic, earth-shattering tremors long before they could see the source through the dense gloom. Then, the God Machine sounded its great war horn. It was a soul-rending blare of acoustic dominance that tore through the empty streets, vibrating in the chest cavities of the Space Marines. To hear that sound had once been the greatest comfort to the Emperor's legions. Now, the mechanical scream possessed a cruel, predatory timbre that chilled the blood of heroes. In that apocalyptic roar, the Loyalists understood the infinite depth of their nightmare. The mightiest siege weapon of the Great Crusade had not come to extract them from the fire. It had come to incinerate them. They looked up at the towering gunmetal bastions and the vast plasma annihilators tracking slowly toward their defensive positions. The Dies Irae had descended not as a righteous savior, but as the ultimate executioner. The suffocating realization settled over the shattered brotherhood as the giant shifted its colossal weight to advance. Every weapon battery along its fortified flanks cycled to full lethal power. The avatar of Betrayal locked its targeting auspex upon the loyal sons of Terra, preparing to harvest their lives. The colossal shadow of the Dies Irae fell across the shattered avenues of the Choral city like the shroud of a dying god. The surviving loyalists had braced for a siege, but what came to them was an apocalypse wrought in adamantium and brass. To stand before an Imperator Titan is to understand the absolute insignificance of flesh. The Emperor's finest, the celebrated heroes of the Great Crusade, were reduced to mere vermin scurrying beneath the iron tread of a mechanical deity. These were Astartes, who had broken alien empires and crushed planetary rebellions without yielding a single step. Now they knew only the bitter taste of utter hell. They fought with the legendary defiance of their gene seed, pouring storms of mass-reactive bolter fire and searing Lascanon beams into the monstrosity. It was an utterly futile gesture. Every volley broke violently against the shimmering energy barriers enveloping the war engine. To comprehend this terrifying asymmetry, one must understand the arcane machinations of Imperial void shield technology. These barriers are not mere walls of static energy, but localized rifts in the fabric of reality itself. When a projectile or energy beam strikes the shielding, the kinetic and thermal payload is not absorbed or deflected. Instead, the energy is forcefully displaced into the churning madness of the warp. A Lascanon beam capable of punching through a main battle tank is simply swallowed and banished into the ether, leaving nothing but a foul atmospheric distortion. To overload a void shield requires a massive, concentrated saturation of heavy ordnance capable of overwhelming the generator's capacity to cycle these spatial displacements. The small arms fire of infantry, even the concentrated anti-armor weaponry of an entire Space Marine company, is mathematically incapable of breaching this threshold. 1,000,000 bolter rounds could strike the barrier, and 1,000,000 rounds would be digested by the immaterium without causing so much as a flicker in the Titan's murderous stride. Shielded by this impregnable sorcery of the Mechanicum, the Dies Irae delivered its answer. The Hellstorm cannon spooled with a deafening, grinding resonance that shattered glass and ruptured eardrums miles away. When the weapon unleashed its fury, it did not merely kill, it erased, Single volleys of apocalyptic energy swept across the ruined plazas, instantly vaporizing entire city blocks. Centuries of architectural triumph were reduced to molten slag in the blink of an eye. Whole companies of loyalist space marines, legendary warriors who had bled for the Imperium on 100 worlds, were atomized before they could even draw breath to scream. Their ceramite armor offered no more protection than paper cast into a roaring furnace. This was the pure, unadulterated wrath of the Omnissiah unleashed upon the sons of Terra. There was no tactical genius that could counter this devastation, no heroic melee charge that could topple a towering machine whose ankles scraped the toxic clouds. The Loyalists could only retreat deeper into the labyrinth of burning rubble, as the sky itself ignited with radioactive fire. The scarred earth trembled violently with every crushing step of the Imperator, driving the desperate survivors backward. They were being herded toward the final crumbling bastions of the planetary capital. The impregnable fortresses of Isstvan III were peeling away like dead skin, exposing the helpless defenders to an invincible horror that hungered only for their absolute. Down in the suffocating ruins of the Choral city, where the heavy tread of the Dies Irae crushed marble and bone alike, a solitary figure walked through the radioactive ash. Mortal survivors, once proud auxiliaries of the Imperial army, were now refugees upon a murdered world. They had fled the corrupted bastions of their command posts, casting themselves into the apocalypse rather than succumb to the taint spreading through the ranks. Above him, the sky bled a bruised and poisonous purple, illuminated by the relentless barrage of his former god. The roar of the Emperor-class Titan shook the very bedrock of Isstvan III, a mechanical majesty of churning gears and shrieking void shields. Against this towering silhouette of apocalyptic ruin, Cassar was utterly insignificant. He was a frail creature of flesh and blood, shivering in the toxic chill of a dying planet. Yet within his mortal breast burned a light that no virus bomb or turbo laser could ever extinguish. He was unbroken. He wandered through the shattered avenues, stepping over the scorched armor of betrayed Astartes and the vaporized remains of the mortal auxiliary. Wherever he found the dying, Cassar fell to his knees in the ash. He held the hands of torn legionaries and weeping soldiers, pressing to their ears the forbidden truths of the Lectitio Divinitatus. He spoke of the God Emperor of mankind, not as a secular warlord, but as a true and divine savior. He offered them salvation in the life to come, even as the world burned around them. It is a bitter irony known only to the silent archives of the Black Library that the modern Imperium was forged here, in the dirt. The origins of the imperial cult did not take root in gilded temples or the high halls of terror. The true faith was born in the ashes of the heresy's first battle, whispered from the lips of a doomed Titan crewman to the bleeding martyrs of a betrayed dream. Here, amidst absolute despair, the seeds of a galaxy-spanning religion were watered with the blood of the loyal. The shadow of the Dies Irae swept over these lone faithful for the final time. As the colossal war engine stepped through the ruins, obliterating the last bastions of resistance, the doomed loyalists simply looked up and embraced their martyrdom. They did not run, nor did they curse the metal god that now brought their doom. They chanted a final prayer to the master of mankind as the apocalyptic tread came down. With the death of these martyrs, the last lingering fragment of human grace before the Titan was extinguished forever. The Dies Irae was now an entirely hollow shell of hatred and iron, wholly surrendered to the dark powers of the warp. The loyalist resistance upon the surface of Isstvan III was finally and brutally broken. Leaving the dead world behind, the corrupted machine turned its immense gaze toward the stars, hungering for the throne of terror itself. The ashes of Isstvan III were left behind to drift in the cold void. Horus had drawn his line in the blood of his own brothers. Now, the traitor armada plunged into the screaming depths of the Empyrean, turning their ruinous gaze toward the throne world of terror. But the path to the Sol system was not merely a journey through physical space. It was a descent into primordial madness. Lorgar and his word-bearers had torn the veil of reality asunder, conjuring the Ruinstorm. This colossal warp anomaly saturated the galaxy in dark magic, a tempest of unhallowed power that swallowed the stars and drowned the cosmos in the raw essence of chaos. Deep within the belly of its massive conveyor vessel, the Dies Irae endured a fitful, restless slumber. The Ruinstorm did not merely batter the void shields of the traitor fleet, it seeped into their very bulkheads. It permeated the sacred oils and crawled through the thousands of miles of adamantium cabling. For the Dies Irae, this transit marked the true death of its noble genesis. The physical and spiritual corruption of the supreme war engine began not with a thunderous blow, but with an insidious infection of the soul. On the command deck, the atmosphere grew suffocatingly dense. The air cyclers labored and whined, unable to scrub away the sudden heavy stench of fresh blood that coated the back of the throat. The crew sat immersed in their amniotic tanks and haptic couches, feeling a creeping rot invade their neural links. The machine spirit of the Imperator, once a paragon of cold and calculating imperial logic, was unraveling. In the lightless depths of the warp, the ancient entity within the adamantium core began to listen to the whispers of the Ruinstorm. Never-born parasites coiled around its binary prayers, substituting logic with a blinding, chaotic rage. The reactor pulsed with an irregular organic rhythm resembling the heartbeat of a caged leviathan rather than the hum of a plasma furnace. The spiritual rot soon manifested in horrifying physical transmutations. Thick armor plating that had deflected the greatest weapons of the Great Crusade began to warp and buckle under the pressure of warp-born malice. Cathedral spires twisted, their sacred geometry breaking down into maddening non-Euclidean angles. Gun barrels blistered and stretched, twisting into screaming metallic maws that hungered for flesh. Gargoyles carved in imperial reverence morphed into leering demonic visages that seemed to track the movement of the terrified serfs. The Dies Irae was no longer a mindless automaton serving the will of mankind. It was awakening into something altogether more sinister, a sentient predator drunk on the dark sorcery of the Empire. With every astral league traversed through the storm of ruin, the machine spirit grew more vicious and bloodthirsty. Its iron heart yearned only to trample the loyal defenders of the Emperor into unrecognizable paste. The corruption took deep, immovable root within the very skeleton of the Titan. Forged as the ultimate icon of imperial compliance, it had been reborn as a profane idol of cosmic slaughter. The colossal beast waited in the dark, gathering its newfound malefic strength as the Armada broke through the tides of the Immaterium, hurtling inexorably toward the ultimate destruction of Terra. The weeping tear of the Ruinstorm violently collapsed, vomiting the nightmare armada of the Warmaster into the cold light of the Sol system. The skies of Terra, shielded for millennia, suddenly darkened beneath the shadows of tens of thousands of traitor vessels. This was the opening stroke of the Siege of Terra, a conflict of such apocalyptic magnitude that human comprehension fractures trying to grasp it. During those opening days, the heavens rained unceasing fire. Orbital bombardment struck the Aegis shields of the Throneworld with the absolute force of dying stars. The void burned with the wreckage of shattered defense platforms, while the atmosphere choked on the toxic ash of vaporized oceans. When the drop pod assaults began, they fell not as a sparse rain, but as an iron storm that entirely eclipsed the sun. Millions of traitor legionaries plummeted to the hallowed earth in a coordinated planetary strike. Their descent painted the stratosphere with trails of bloody incandescence, signaling the arrival of the damned. Amidst this unimaginable tempest of destruction, the massive bulk landers descended, bearing the heaviest instruments of the Warmaster's wrath. The ground of Terra quaked as the mighty Dies Irae stepped from its transport onto the cradle of humanity. This was no longer the shining avatar of the Emperor's truth. The Imperial defenders stationed along the outer ramparts stared through their macro binoculars, paralyzed by a profound, freezing terror. Before them stood the legendary hero of Ullanor, a mechanical god that had once brought countless Xenos empires to ruin in the name of terror. Now it was a walking blasphemy. Its majestic armor panels, once gleaming and proud, were stripped of imperial gold and drowned in the bruised, sickening colors of the warp. Gruesome trophies hung from its colossal bastions. Hundreds of flayed corpses were chained to its adamantium legs, swinging like pendulum metronomes of madness with every earth-shattering step. The defaced heraldry of the Legio Mortis had been completely overwritten with the cruel, jagged geometry of the eight-pointed star. To witness the Dies Irae was to look upon the very death of the Great Crusade. Loyal guardsmen and stoic Astartes alike wept inside their helmets, their resolve shattered against the visceral shock of such profound, unfathomable corruption. The machine spirit of the Titan, now howling with demonic sentience, broadcast a localized wave of pure dread that bled through every encrypted Vox channel. It was a physical weight, crushing the hope from the lungs of the desperate defenders. The corrupted God engine raised its apocalyptic weapons toward the golden horizon of the palace. Its plasma annihilator glowed with the sick, mutating light of the Empyrean. Ahead lay the greatest fortifications ever conceived by the mind of mankind. The final walls of the Imperial Palace stood unyielding, daring the twisted beast to strike. The Dies Irae sounded its war horn, a sound that was no longer a binary blare, but the collective screaming of a billion damned souls. The behemoth leaned into the firestorm, marching forward to test the ultimate endurance of the Throneworld. The landing zones of Terra were mere stepping stones for the apocalyptic wrath of the Dies Irae. The great Imperator Titan strode forth through the choking ash and ruined Ferrocrete to spearhead the assault upon the Lion's Gate spaceport. This colossal strategic artery was the key to the outer defenses of the Imperial Palace. To hold it was to control the flow of the war. To lose it was to invite the end of the Imperial. Standing in defiance of the traitor advance were the mighty engines of the Legio Ignatum. The Fire Wasps were one of the oldest and most venerated Titan legions in human history. They were bound by sacred oaths to serve as the direct shield of the Emperor himself. Clad in the crimson and gold of their ancient heraldry, the warlord Titans of the Ignatum stepped out from the colossal hangars to meet the betrayers. What followed was an engine war of such apocalyptic fury that the very bedrock of terror fractured beneath their tread. The Lion's Gate became a cauldron of obliterating light. Searing beams of coherent plasma and hypervelocity macro shells crossed the devastated tarmac in a blinding grid of death. The warlord Titans of the Fire Wasps moved with the synchronized grace of apex predators. They focused their devastating thermal lances and volcano cannons upon the towering silhouette of the Dies Irae. Layer upon layer of the Imperator's void shields flared into brilliant, agonizing spectrums of violet and white before collapsing under the staggering bombardment. Solid adamantium cracked and molten ceramite bled from the flanks of the traitor behemoth. Lesser engines would have been vaporized in a single heartbeat. Entire maniples of standard war machines would have been reduced to glowing slag. Yet the Dies Irae did not fall. The dark heart of the machine thrummed with unnatural malice, shrugging off apocalyptic impacts that cratered its sprawling bastion keeps. Possessed by a demonic vitality and driven by the hatred of the Legio Mortis, the Imperator unleashed its own catastrophic response. Its hellstorm cannons roared, drowning the spaceport in a tidal wave of superheated annihilation. The plasma annihilator mounted on its vast carapace fired with the brilliance of a dying sun. Void shields belonging to the proud warlords of the Ignatum shattered like fragile glass under the overwhelming barrage. Noble engines that had served since the Unification Wars were decapitated and torn asunder, their reactor cores detonating in catastrophic nuclear blooms. The Fire Wasps fought with unyielding, desperate valor, but they were being systematically ground into the dust by a deity of iron and hate. The supreme dominance of the Dies Irae was absolute. One by one, the crimson giants of the loyalist defenders fell dead upon the burning plains of the spaceport. The colossal defensive guns of the Lion's Gate were silenced, their shattered emplacements swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The immense blast doors of the orbital hub were torn from their moorings, leaving the vital staging ground completely overrun by the forces of the Warmaster. A pathway through the outer defences had been ruthlessly carved in fire and blood. The immense metallic footfalls of the Dies Irae now turned inward, shaking the earth as it began its relentless march toward the inner walls of the palace. The triumph at the Lion's Gate was not merely a victory of iron and fire, it was the catalyst for a blasphemous apotheosis. Saturated by the slaughter of millions and bathed in the thinning veil of reality, the Dies Irae began to rot from the inside out. The sheer concentration of suffering acted as a beacon to the Imperator. What was once the pride of the Legio Mortis succumbed to a profound and grotesque metamorphosis. The god machine ceased to be a mere instrument of war. It became a living nightmare. Across its colossal frame, cold adamantium bulkheads softened and began to bleed a viscous blood. The grand basilica mounted upon its broad shoulders, once a monument to the martial glory of the emperor, twisted into a shrieking cathedral of chaos. Spires of plasteel warped into jagged bone. Stone gargoyles, carved centuries ago by blind artisans, suddenly snapped their jaws and spread leathery wings. They tore themselves free from the Gothic archways to swarm like carrion birds around the Titan. Deep within the armoured cranial vault, Princeps Turnit and his Moderati suffered a fate worse than any mortal death. The amniotic fluid of the command manifold boiled into blistering blood. Neurocables and sensory plugs pushed deeper into their flesh, burrowing like mechanical parasites into their spines and skulls. Skin sloughed away to reveal bone that instantly fused with the copper and brass of the control consoles. Turnit and his crew were biologically welded to their stations. They no longer drove the Titan. They were digested by it. Their humanity was consumed, replaced by the boundless malice of the warp. To understand this horror is to comprehend the arcane blasphemy of the demon engine. When the boundary between the material realm and the immaterium dissolves, physics itself is overwritten by the sentient will of the warp. A demon engine is born when a never-born entity is violently bound into a mechanical shell. The metal is forced to accommodate the impossible geometry of a soul forged from pure hatred. Gears and pistons are transformed into organs of warp-infused muscle and tendon. Reactor cores ignite with hellfire, fueled not by plasma, but by the tormented souls of the slain. The machine becomes conscious, hungering for slaughter with a predatory instinct xenos to any cogitator. The laws of mass, thermodynamics and gravity weep and collapse under the weight of this paradox. The Dies Irae had crossed this terrifying threshold. It was no longer a construct of the mechanicum. It was a conduit for the dark gods, a walking apocalypse of fused flesh, cursed iron and demonic spite. Every step it took scorched the earth with warp-tainted radiation. Every blare of its war horn was the chorus of 1 billion damned souls screaming in agony. Now fully empowered by the primordial annihilator, the abomination shifted its colossal weight. Through eyes burning with unholy witchfire, the monstrous engine turned its gaze toward the innermost defences of the palace. It marched onward, a moving hell prepared to shatter the ultimate bastion of mankind. Now the nightmare made manifest marched upon the ultimate redoubt. The Eternity Spaceport had fallen, leaving only the Eternity Wall standing between the traitor hordes and the Sanctum Imperialis. This was no mere fortification. It was the crowning architectural triumph of Rogal Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra. Dorn had overseen the augmentation of the palace walls with obsessive, uncompromising genius. The Eternity Wall was not built to merely halt an army. It was engineered to withstand the death of continents. Beneath layered void shields of cascading energy lay meters-thick slabs of forged ceramite and solid adamantium. These interlocking plates were anchored deeply into the ancient bedrock of the Himalayas, reinforced by a skeletal lattice of macro-ferrocrete designed to absorb tectonic impacts and planetary quakes. To breach this leviathan of stone and steel with conventional artillery would require centuries of uninterrupted barrage. Yet the arch-traitor did not bring conventional artillery. Horus brought the Dies Irae. The monstrous god machine anchored its massive clawed feet into the pulverized rockcrete of the outer approaches. It was the singular engine of destruction in the entire traitor armada, capable of shattering Dawn's masterpiece. Its colossal plasma annihilators and hellstorm cannons leveled their muzzles at the invincible bastion. Then began an agonizing, relentless bombardment that would forever echo through the darkest annals of Imperial history. For days without end, the Dies Irae unleashed the fury of a captive sun upon the Eternity Wall. Its plasma reactors, now burning with a warp-fueled, unnatural heat, screamed against the limits of mechanical endurance. Ethereal flames of sickening magenta and bruised purple vomited from its primary weapons, striking the adamantium defenses with apocalyptic force. The void shields held for a time, flaring with blinding intensity before overloading and collapsing into showers of static lightning. Once the energy barriers fell, the brute physical torment of the wall commenced. Even the impregnable armor crafted by the Praetorian could not defy the corrupted fusion blasts forever. The unnatural heat of the demon engine began to slowly, agonizingly melt the adamantium plates. Molten metal wept down the sheer precipice like glowing blood from a fatal wound. Vast sections of ceramite shattered under the extreme thermal shock, raining down upon the defenders below in deadly avalanches of burning slag. Upon the battlements, the Imperial fists stood resolute amidst the incinerating tempest. They were the unbroken sons of Dawn, tasked with holding a line that was physically disintegrating beneath their armored boots. Yellow ceramite blackened and blistered in the ambient heat of the Titan's continuous fusillade. They fired blindly into the smoke and blinding plasma flares, choking on the ashes of their own indomitable fortress. The air itself turned to venomous vapor, yet the superhuman warriors did not take a single step backward. They watched in grim defiance as the unbreakable stones of terror turned to liquid magma. The Dies Irae did not pause, did not falter, and did not cool. Its demonic heart pumped endless malice into its weapons, continuing the barrage until the structural integrity of the mountain itself began to scream. The foundational groan of failing adamantium reverberated across the ruined landscape, signaling that the impossible was finally coming to pass. For unrelenting days and nights, the apocalyptic fury of the Dies Irae had battered the Eternity Wall. Now, the impossible finally happened. The grandest fortification ever conceived by human minds groaned under the weight of catastrophic structural failure. Billions of tons of ferrocrete, adamantium and ceramite buckled and sheared apart. The collapse was a tectonic event, a man-made earthquake that sent shockwaves deep into the mantle of terror itself. Great towers that had scraped the poisoned heavens plummeted into the dust, burying tens of thousands of loyalist defenders beneath continents of shattered metal and pulverized stone. The physical shield of the Emperor had been broken. In the brutal calculus of siegecraft, a wall provides far more than mere kinetic deflection. It is the psychological anchor of a defending army. A fortress wall is a promise of safety, a towering monument to the idea that the horrors of the outside world can be kept at bay. When that wall holds, the spirit of the soldier holds. But when a breach is torn into the impenetrable, the devastation is absolute. The shattering of the barricade destroys the mind long before the invading blade ever touches the flesh. To witness the destruction of an absolute barrier is to witness the death of reason. The defenders of the Imperial Palace watched their invincible bastion crumble, and with it, the very concept of hope ceased to exist. The sanctuary was open, violated by the fires of treason. Through the choking, continent-sized clouds of dust and burning promethium, a leviathan shadow emerged. The Dies Irae stepped through the colossal ruins of the Eternity Wall. It crushed the debris of humanity's greatest achievement beneath its cursed treads. As it crossed the threshold into the inner sanctum of the palace, the Emperor Titan unleashed a roar that defied all mechanical origins. It was a demonic bellow, a sound forged in the deepest pits of the warp, vibrating with the malice of murdered worlds. That sonic atrocity washed over the loyalist lines, snapping the final threads of their sanity and courage. Veteran legionaries and mortal conscripts alike recoiled in terror. Men threw down their weapons, weeping in absolute, paralyzing despair. The unbreachable had been breached. The apex predator of the dark gods had come to claim the Throneworld, and there was nothing left to stand in its path. The hosts of the Warmaster surged forward in the wake of the great engine, howling for the blood of their father. Total victory lay naked and defenseless before the traitors. The inner sanctum was theirs to plunder, and the Dies Irae raised its gargantuan weapons to deliver the killing blow to the Imperium of man. The execution of a species was at hand. Yet in that singular moment of impending annihilation, the very fabric of reality across the galaxy shuddered. High above the weeping ruins of the Imperial Palace, within the corrupted iron belly of the vengeful spirit, the Master of Mankind delivered the ultimate sanction. The Emperor did not merely strike down his favored son in the physical realm. He unleashed a torrent of psychic fury that obliterated the very soul of Horus Lupercal from the tapestry of existence. In the deep, turbulent currents of the Immaterium, a Primarch is a vast constellation of raw resonance, a blazing sun of warp-born energy bound perfectly in mortal flesh. To extinguish such a monumental entity in a singular fraction of a second requires a detonation of incomprehensible telepathic violence. The absolute annihilation of the Warmaster birthed an astro-telepathic shockwave of profound magnitude. It was a blinding tsunami of psychic force that radiated outward from the traitor flagship and crashed violently down upon the bruised atmosphere of terror. To the uncorrupted mortal mind, this celestial wave manifested as a sudden, sickening vertigo, a profound silence that stole the breath from the lungs of billions. But to those twisted entities bound entirely to the warp, it was an apocalyptic cataclysm. At the heart of the shattered Sanctum Imperialis, the god-engine Dies Irae was in the very act of supreme butchery. The monstrous Imperator Titan had breached the final gates and was relentlessly slaughtering the last desperate ranks of the inner defenders. It had become far more than a simple machine of war. Through dark rituals and endless bloodshed, the towering behemoth was deeply attuned to the Immaterium, its colossal frame pulsing with the same chaotic frequencies that empowered the Warmaster. Countless demonic entities and warp-spawned parasites had woven themselves deeply into the plasma veins and cogitator arrays of the great machine. When the psychic death scream of Horus struck the surface of the Throneworld, the immaterial realm violently recoiled. The invisible shockwave hit the Dies Irae with the devastating force of a physical hammer blow. The titanic war engine shuddered and abruptly halted its advance, reeling in sudden, impossible agony. Thick adamantium armor plates groaned and buckled as the demonic entities trapped within its iron guts shrieked in absolute terror. The dark spirits powering the reactor cores withered under the blinding light of the Emperor's psychic resonance, causing the machine itself to vomit black fire and toxic plasma from its towering exhausts. The unbreakable psychic tether that bound the traitor host to their dark messiah was severed instantly. Across the burning courtyards of the palace, the absolute certainty of heretical victory dissolved into a chaotic, mindless panic. The invincible conquerors of the galaxy felt the death of their false god echo through their very marrow, their minds breaking under the sudden, crushing weight of cosmic emptiness. Savage predators instantly became fleeing prey as the corrupted legions turned upon one another in their desperate haste to escape the blinding psychic light. The mighty Dies Irae, The great apocalyptic beast that had stood poised to grind the very heart of the Imperium into dust ceased its glorious slaughter, bellowing a corrupted blast from its war horns that now sounded only like the desperate wail of a wounded animal. The God Engine turned its colossal bulk away from the inner sanctum, abandoning its great conquest to begin a lumbering, terrified flight from the vengeance of the surviving loyalists. The Warmaster was dead. The psychic shockwave of his unmaking shattered the minds of the traitor host and broke the Siege of Terra in a single agonizing stroke. Where once there had been the organized fury of a conquering armada, there was now only the blind panic of desperate prey. Among the routed millions, the Dies Irae dragged its colossal bulk through the irradiated ash of the Throneworld. This was the imperious engine that had breached the majestic walls of the imperial palace. This was the mechanical god that had stalked the killing fields of Isstvan with untouchable arrogance, proclaiming the death of the old order. Now it was a crippled, pathetic beast, weeping sacred oils and venting radioactive fire from 1,000 bleeding wounds. Its gargantuan war horns no longer blared with the apocalyptic triumph of the dark gods. Instead, they emitted only discordant mechanical shrieks as its corrupted princeps forced the ruined Titan toward the waiting dropships. The mighty Legio Mortis, once the feared vanguard of the Dark Mechanicum, scrambled like vermin to escape the righteous wrath of the surviving loyalists. The Dies Irae was unceremoniously hauled into the cavernous belly of a massive transport, its shattered legs buckling under the weight of its own devastated armor. It was no longer a harbinger of inevitable victory, but a battered monument to the heresy's ultimate failure. As the ragged remnants of the traitor fleet tore themselves from Terra's orbit, the great exodus of the damned began. This desperate, chaotic flight would be recorded in the forbidden archives as the genesis of the Scouring. The defenders of humanity, deeply traumatized by the devastation of their home and the mortal wounding of the Emperor, did not simply watch the traitors flee into the void. They became relentless, cold-blooded executioners. Loyalist armadas immediately gave chase across the blackened galaxy, ruthlessly hunting down the shattered fragments of the rebel legions. There was no mercy offered and absolutely no quarter given in this new era of bloody retribution. The avenging angels drove the sons of Horus and their treacherous kin from system to system, burning their dark sanctuaries and slaughtering their stragglers without hesitation. The Dies Irae was trapped within this running nightmare, imprisoned in the dark, suffocating hold of its fleeing conveyor. The wounded Titan endured the humiliating voyage across the bleeding stars, driven ever outward toward the galactic northwest by the relentless pursuit of the Imperium. There was only one refuge left for those who had sold their souls to absolute ruin. The battered fleet plunged toward the swirling, unnatural madness of the Eye of Terror. The fabric of reality itself tore open to welcome the defeated architects of the Great Rebellion. Swallowed by the primordial energies of the warp, the Dies Irae passed from the realm of the physical universe into the nightmare domain of chaos. It vanished entirely into the Great Rift, carrying the eternal shame of a broken crusade into the lightless abyss. "10,000 years is a span of time sufficient to grind mountains to dust and erase empires from the memory of man. For the Imperium of mankind, the 10 millennia following the Siege of Terra were an age of slow, suffocating decay. The agonizing reality of the Horus heresy faded first into history, then into legend, and finally into the suffocating dogma of the imperial cult. The terrible god engines that had shattered the walls of the imperial palace were largely forgotten by the teeming trillions who toiled in the factorums. The Dies Irae, the great beast that had spearheaded the death of the dream, ceased to be a documented threat. It devolved into a shadowy bogeyman, a cautionary tale whispered by drill abbots in the Schola Progenium to terrify unruly cadets into obedience. They told the orphans of the Imperium that if they faltered in their faith, the walking mountain of iron and heresy would come to grind their bones into mortar. The Imperium believed the monster was dead, lost forever to the abyss of the past. But the Imperium was blind to the true nature of the Great Wound in reality. Within the swirling madness of the Eye of Terror, the inflexible laws of real space hold no dominion. Time does not flow like a steady river in the realm of the dark gods. It pools, it fractures, and it runs backward upon itself. This temporal distortion is the cruel miracle that sustains the traitor legions. While 100 centuries of attrition bled the Imperium dry, the veterans of the heresy experienced only a fraction of that eternity. For the crew of the Dies Irae, trapped within the screaming currents of the Imperator-class, perhaps only a few centuries had passed. For some within its tainted corridors, it may have been mere decades since they retreated from the Sol system. They did not age into dust. Instead, they stewed in a concentrated, timeless purgatory of warp madness. The Eye of Terror did not simply harbor the Dies Irae, it reshaped it. The boundary between the organic and the mechanical, already violated during the rebellion, completely dissolved. Princeps Turnet and his Moderati fused permanently with the amniotic tanks and control thrones, their nervous systems weaving into the corrupted fibril networks of the God Engine. Demonic flesh spilled from its exhaust vents, and its war horns bellowed with the trapped souls of a billion slaughtered innocents. The Dies Irae was no longer merely a weapon of war. It had become a pure, walking vessel for the ruinous powers, a cathedral of absolute desecration bathed in the light of dead stars. In the false safety of the 41st millennium, the Imperium prayed to the God Emperor, entirely unaware that the bogeyman of their childhood nightmares had not perished. It had only been gestating in the dark, waiting for the barriers of real space to weaken so that the great beast could walk the stars once more. In the waning centuries of the 41st millennium, the slumbering myths of the ancient past are summoned to wakefulness by new architects of ruin. The warsmith of the Iron Warriors steps from the roiling madness of the Eye of Terror with a cold and calculating mind. He is a ruthless master of the agonizing siege, driven by a hatred refined over 10,000 years of bitter exile. His unblinking gaze fixes upon the fortress world of Hydra Cordatus. To the ignorant masses of the Imperium, it is merely another heavily defended rock in a galaxy consumed by endless war. Yet the warsmith knows it harbors a secret of unfathomable value to the prosecution of the Long War. Deep beneath its heavily fortified crust lies a massive hidden vault of Imperial gene seed. To the traitor legions of the Warp, untainted gene seed is a prize infinitely greater than 1,000 conquered worlds. The ruinous powers of chaos constantly corrupt and degrade the genetic legacy of the traitors, mutating their biological harvest until it is entirely useless for the creation of new space marines. Untainted Imperial gene seed is the vital lifeblood of their future armies. It is the pure, stolen essence desperately required to breed a terrifying new generation of transhuman monsters. The warsmith knows that capturing this magnificent tithe will instantly secure his supremacy within his fractured legion and replenish the drastically thinning ranks of his corrupted brethren. Yet Hydra Cordatus is no simple prize waiting to be claimed. Its planetary defenses are a staggering masterpiece of void-shielded citadels, labyrinthine trench networks, and utterly lethal interlocking kill zones. These unyielding bastions were meticulously designed by the master architects of the Imperial Fists. The blood feud between the Iron Warriors and the noble sons of Rogel Dawn is a primal, eternal animosity forged in the catastrophic fires of the Horus Heresy. To tear down a mighty fortress built by the Imperial Fists is to strike a grievous, deeply personal blow against the pride of Dawn himself. It is a profound ideological necessity for the bitter sons of Perturabo to prove their absolute superiority in the cruel art of the siege. The warsmith fully intends to reduce their vaunted walls to radioactive dust, but he knows that conventional warfare will shatter uselessly against this mathematically perfect bastion. To violently breach such a flawless planetary defense The warsmith requires a weapon that defies the very scale of modern warfare. He desperately needs a siege engine of mythical, apocalyptic proportions to shatter the unbreakable world. The cunning warsmith looks beyond his own legion, reaching out in the darkness to form a dread pact with the dark adepts of the traitor Titan legions. He calls upon the infernal might of the Legio Mortis. The warsmith turns his cold, calculating mind to the slumbering legends of the deep past, seeking to awaken a mechanical terror that has rested in the shadows for 10 millennia. To crack the impregnable shell of Hydra Cordatus, the master of the siege prepares to unleash the ultimate ancient avatar of destruction upon the modern battlefield. The iron rain of the traitor legions had already begun to bleed the sacred soil of Hydra Cordatus. The mortal defenders of the Imperial Guard manned the trench lines and plascrete bastions with the stoic discipline demanded by the Golden Throne. Beside them stood the towering engines of the Legio Ignatum, the venerable fire wasps, their war horns sounding a defiant, booming chorus against the traitorous advance of the Iron Warriors. For a brief moment, the Imperial line held against the overwhelming tide. The Departamento Munitorum instills a rigid, unyielding psychological conditioning within every soldier of the Astra Militarum. A guardsman is taught to fear the wrath of the Emperor and the swift execution of the Commissar far more than the countless horrors of a hostile galaxy. They are rigorously drilled to look upon biological nightmares, Xenos atrocities, and heretical uprisings with unblinking righteous hatred. Their minds are forged into shields of ignorance and faith. Yet no amount of mortal indoctrination can protect a fragile human soul from the crushing, suffocating weight of a living myth. The sky above the besieged fortress suddenly darkened as unnatural clouds gathered, bleeding bruised and sickly colours that defied all sane comprehension. The very air grew cold and heavy with the stench of ancient malice. The heavens shrieked in agony as a massive warp-tainted bulk lander descended through the atmosphere, eclipsing the sun and casting a shadow of absolute, freezing despair across the entire battlefield. The ground quaked violently as the titanic landing claws bit into the bedrock. Then the massive assault ramps descended. What stepped forth onto the ashen plains of Hydra Cordatus was not merely a machine of war. It was a 10,000-year-old nightmare given physical, blasphemous form. The Dies Irae had returned. Even the most hardened, battle-scarred veterans of the trenches felt their sanity fray and snap, their perfectly disciplined ranks dissolving into trembling terror as the colossal Emperor Titan stood before them. This was the very beast that had battered down the sacred walls of the Imperial Palace during the dark days of the Horus Heresy. It was the ultimate avatar of betrayal, a demonic engine that had drowned entire sectors in the blood of the faithful over millennia. The dark metal of its corrupted hull writhed with the bound, screaming souls of millions, and its towering Gothic spires pulsed with a sickening, chaotic light. To look upon the Dies Irae was to look upon the death of hope itself. Lasguns and heavy bolters slipped from the numb, trembling fingers of the defenders. Desperate prayers caught in their throats, choking the faithful as the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the atrocity paralyzed them where they stood. The dark aura of the warp bled constantly from its gargantuan joints, projecting a localized wave of psychic agony that shattered the courage of men who had sworn to die on their feet. Even the proud and ancient princeps of the Legio Ignatum felt a profound, primal dread echo painfully through their manifold connections. The Dies Irae raised its colossal weapons, the devastating plasma annihilator and the hellstorm cannon glowing with the furious heat of a murdered star. A deafening roar of demonic triumph erupted from its titanic voxcasters, a sound that ruptured eardrums and shattered minds across the entire Imperial trench network. The walking apocalypse began its slow, inevitable advance toward the high bastions, preparing to tear the unbreakable fortress apart, stone by shattered stone. The landing of the Dies Irae was not merely a physical deployment, but the arrival of a walking apocalypse. It brought with it the very ghosts of the Horus heresy, casting a 10,000-year shadow over the killing fields of Hydra Cordatus. It began its grim work exactly as it had at the walls of the imperial palace so long ago. There was no haste in its movements, only a relentless mechanical precision married to an absolute demonic fury. To understand the magnitude of this threat, one must understand the absolute defiance of an imperial citadel. The bastions of the Imperium are protected by layered void shield networks, which are true marvels of ancient human engineering. These are not mere physical barriers of rockcrete or adamantium. They are localized dimensional anomalies that shunt incoming kinetic and energetic trauma directly into the roaring depths of the immaterium. To break them requires far more than mere explosive bombardment. It demands an overwhelming, sustained concentration of apocalyptic energy to overload the ancient emitters and collapse the warp displacement fields. A fortress like Hydra Cordatus is explicitly designed to withstand the continuous fury of orbital armadas and the pounding of 1,000 heavy artillery batteries. Yet the Dies Irae was built to unmake such impregnable logic. The trapped defenders of the citadel poured everything they had into the looming monster. Tremendous artillery barrages and searing orbital lances hammered the dark god machine without pause. The sky burned with the golden fury of their desperate retribution, but the chaotic void shields of the Imperator Titan simply ate the damage. The corrupted energies dancing across its ancient hull consumed the imperial fire as a starving beast consumes raw meat. Then the Dies Irae finally answered. Its colossal hellstorm cannon spun to life with agonizing slowness. It was a multi-barreled engine of obliteration that fired with a roar loud enough to crack the tectonic plates of the world. Torrents of irradiated plasma and hyperkinetic munitions slammed into the outermost void shields of Hydra Cordatus. The Titan did not blindly sweep its fire across the battlefield. It concentrated every single iota of its wrath upon a single mathematical focal point. The demonic machine spirit within the Titan calculated the exact harmonic resonance required to break the imperial wardings. The sky shrieked and cracked as the first layer of shields collapsed under the impossible strain. Then the second layer shattered like brittle glass. The primary generators deep within the fortress violently detonated from the catastrophic energy feedback. The Dies Irae was systematically stripping the fortress bare, peeling away its impregnable armor with terrifying methodical ease. Mighty bastions that had stood unblemished for millennia began to vaporize under the unrelenting onslaught. The horrifying truth settled upon the commanders of the garrison like a suffocating shroud of lead. Conventional victory against this walking engine of myth was a mathematical impossibility. To remain hidden behind their crumbling walls meant waiting for absolute annihilation. The cold logic of defensive survival had entirely evaporated, leaving them with only one final tactical option. They would have to abandon their sanctuaries and launch a desperate suicidal strike directly into the teeth of the beast. As the fortress walls crumbled into radioactive dust, the surviving infantry found themselves entirely exposed to the wrath of the Dies Irae. To buy them precious time, the loyalist engines of Legio Ignatum marched directly into the shadow of the monstrous Imperator. The fire wasps knew they were walking into a crucible from which they would not return. Their warlord titans were apex predators of conventional battlefields, towering behemoths of armored devastation. Yet standing before the mutated bulk of the Dies Irae, they looked like mere children. The traitor engine was an abomination of rusted steel and pulsing meat, a cathedral of damnation that blotted out the poisoned sky. The Loyalists unleashed the full fury of their arsenals in a desperate bid to halt its advance. A standard warlord titan boasts apocalyptic firepower, wielding volcano cannons capable of firing sustained beams of pure thermal energy to melt through meters of adamantium plating. They paired these with quake cannons, massive artillery pieces that lobbed macro shells designed to fracture tectonic plates and liquefy enemy armor through sheer kinetic trauma. Under normal circumstances, a concentrated barrage from a maniple of fire wasps would easily cripple a hostile engine. But the Dies Irae was no longer bound by the laws of physics or mortal engineering. The Loyalist ordnance struck the Imperator, but the killing blows failed to penetrate. The traitor Titan was cloaked in a foul miasma of warp energy that absorbed the searing heat of the volcano cannons. When the quake cannon shells detonated against its legs, the jagged rents in the armor simply bled a black, corrosive ichor before the warp-infused metal knit itself back together. The dark sorcery of the ruinous powers rendered the grandest weapons of the Adeptus Mechanicus utterly impotent. In return, the Dies Irae delivered a visceral, agonizing slaughter. The engine war devolved into an execution. The mutated Imperator strode forward, unleashing barrages of corrupt plasma and shrieking macro lasers that washed over the Loyalist warlords. Void shields collapsed in blinding flashes of static. The majestic red and gold armor of the fire wasps instantly turned to bubbling slag. Over the open Vox channels, the screams of the Loyalist crews provided a horrific symphony of despair. Princeps boiled alive within their amniotic tanks as neural feedback loops subjected them to the phantom agony of their engines being torn apart. The Dies Irae closed the distance, using its colossal weaponized limbs to literally rip a warlord titan in half. Severed power conduits whipped wildly, spraying the ash-choked air with blazing plasma as the Loyalist engine collapsed into a mountain of burning ruin. Another Fire Wasp engine lost its legs to a localized gravity collapse, dragging its ruined torso across the battlefield while its crew burned to ash. They were being dismantled limb from screaming limb, sacrificed to buy mere minutes for the fleeing infantry. The glorious Legio Ignatum was being butchered, their noble sacrifice barely slowing the apocalyptic stride of the traitor god machine. With the mightiest engines of the Imperium reduced to burning scrap, the defenders realized that no feat of traditional warfare could fell the beast. If the lines were to hold, survival would require a strategy born of pure, desperate madness. With the holy engines of the Loyalist Legios reduced to smouldering slag upon the ashen plains, conventional victory became a shattered illusion. The Imperial commanders gathered in the trembling depths of their subterranean bunkers, forced to confront a terrifying mathematical certainty. No macro cannon battery or orbital strike could pierce the overlapping void shields and warp-fused adamantium plating of the traitor Titan. To strike at the beast from the outside was to hurl stones at a dying sun. Thus, desperation birthed a strategy of profound and suicidal madness. If the behemoth could not be battered down from the heavens, it must be gutted from within. Tactical cogitators and frantic tech priests isolated a singular microscopic vulnerability. The Titan possessed a beating heart of chained fury. Its primary plasma reactor, a caged star corrupted by the touch of the dark gods, lay entombed deep within the primary torso carapace. Destroying this heavily shielded core would trigger a catastrophic meltdown, immolating the god machine in a pyre of its own making. Yet to reach this blasphemous altar required an ascent through hell itself. The strategic briefing offered no illusions of survival, only the cold promise of martyrdom. Infantry squads would be required to cross the scorched earth, physically breach the lower joints of the Titan, and fight their way upward through its very veins. To understand the sheer lunacy of this endeavor, one must comprehend the structural anatomy of an Imperator-class Titan. Its legs are not mere mechanical limbs, but sprawling ambulatory fortresses capable of housing entire regiments. The adamantium greaves conceal labyrinthine networks of staging decks, ammunition hoppers, and heavily fortified bastions. These internal spiraling corridors were originally designed to repel boarding actions, studded with automated sentry turrets and concealed murder holes. Now, these claustrophobic halls overflowed with the rotting nightmares of the Dark Mechanicum. Entire companies of traitor Skitarii stalked the rusted catwalks, their augmetics infected with scrap code and their flesh fused to their ruined weaponry. Packs of heavily mutated servitors and warp-spawned abominations prowled the lower cooling vents, hungry for the blood of the faithful. Every staircase and transit elevator within the leg bastions represented a heavily fortified choke point. There would be no room for grand maneuvers or armored support in this vertical nightmare. The assault forces would be funneled into a merciless meat grinder of point-blank slaughter, trading thousands of lives for mere meters of bloody deck plating. The commanders sealed the orders with drops of hot wax and silent prayers to the Golden Throne. The suicide battalions were armed with melter charges, trench shotguns and heavy flamers, their souls already committed to the Emperor. As the ramp doors of the assault transports slammed shut, the nature of the war fundamentally changed. The sweeping majesty of Titan clash and macro warfare faded into irrelevance, replaced by the grim prospect of a slaughter in the absolute dark. The breaches in the ankle bastions of the Dies Irae were not merely holes blasted in armor, but wounds torn into the flesh of a living. The Imperial boarding party, an alliance of desperate guardsmen and battered local defenders, hurled themselves into the dark. What they found within the great legs of the Titan was not the cold precision of mechanical engineering, but a realm of pure survival horror. The interior of the war machine had been twisted into a biomechanical nightmare. The halls were lined with pulsing, bruised flesh that fused seamlessly with rusted bulkheads. Weeping metal bled caustic fluids from ceiling vents, raining down upon the invaders like acidic tears. It was a house of horrors where the very geometry defied sanity, looping in impossible angles that induced madness in the unaugmented mind. To enter a demon engine is to subject the soul to an environment actively hostile to natural life. Here, the corrupted machine spirit manifests a localized atmosphere of pure scrap code. This is a virulent, digital plague that bleeds from the cognitive realm into physical reality. Within the belly of such a beast, the air itself becomes a weapon. To breathe without blessed filtration is to inhale the whispered lies of the warp, inviting instantaneous mutation or fatal hemorrhaging of the brain. The Vox channels of the Imperial troops were rendered entirely useless, flooded with shrieking binary that could shatter glass and rupture eardrums. Unprotected guardsmen tore off their own helmets, driven completely insane by the scrap code transmitting directly into their skulls. Yet the assault force had no choice but to climb. They fought their way upward through the calves and knee joints of the Titan, battling inch by inch through claustrophobic corridors. The internal defense systems of the Dies Irae did not deploy mechanical sentries, but birthed abominations. Hordes of misshapen mutants, spawned directly from the corrupted amniotic vats of the engine, clawed their way out of the pulsing walls. Demons of rust and decay slithered from ventilation shafts, dragging screaming soldiers into the dark. The Space Marines fought with the fury of betrayed suns, their bolters illuminating the fleshy catacombs with strobe flashes of explosive light. Even their superhuman resilience was tested to its absolute limit. Blessed power armor was breached by acidic vomit and rusted blades, dragging noble warriors down into piles of writhing filth. Casualties were not merely high, but apocalyptic. Whole platoons were swallowed by organic traps, digested alive by a Titan that had become an apex predator of the warp. The stench of ozone, burned promethium, and roasting meat choked the passageways. Still, the dwindling spearhead pushed higher into the torso of the abominable engine. They stepped over the liquefied remains of their brothers and ignored the psychic howling that tore at their sanity. Through the slaughter and the madness, a singular and desperate focus remained. The surviving veterans finally battered down a sequence of blast doors slick with gore, feeling a sudden and immense wave of unnatural heat wash over them. Ahead lay the thrumming, corrupted heart of the monster itself. Ascending from the nightmarish vertical trench of the god engine shattered limbs, the battered remnants of the strike force finally breached the grand reliquary of the primary plasma reactor. Here, the very heart of the Titan had been laid bare and twisted into a blasphemous cathedral dedicated to the ruinous powers. The vast chamber defied the sacred geometry of the Adeptus Mechanicus, its bulkheads draped in flayed flesh and etched with weeping runes that burned the eyes of the faithful. At the center of this profane shrine hung the reactor core itself, a captive, hateful sun radiating a sickly, mutated luminescence. This chained star roared with the chained fury of a trapped god, illuminating the desperate final stand of the loyalist brethren. The defenders of this corrupted sanctum were endless, pouring from unseen alcoves and ventilation shafts like maggots from a rotting corpse. Twisted tech heretics and warp-spawned abominations threw themselves at the strike force in a tidal wave of shrieking metal and mutated muscle. Bolters roared until their barrels glowed white-hot, tearing through the frenzied hordes. But for every abomination felled, 3 more clambered over the twitching remains. The Loyalists knew there would be no extraction, no victorious return to the golden light of terror. They had come only to deliver a fatal wound. Bleeding, exhausted, and fighting through unimaginable agony, the surviving battle brothers pushed through the tide of corrupted flesh to reach the massive humming pillars of the reactor containment apparatus. With hands trembling from fatigue and blessed fury, they clamped the heavy melter charges directly onto the magnetic confinement coils. In the holy doctrines of plasma technology, the magnetic containment field is the singular barrier between regulated power and absolute annihilation. These invisible, overlapping cages of intense electromagnetic force are designed to hold stellar plasma at temperatures that would vaporize solid adamantium in a fraction of a second. Should these fields falter, even for a single heartbeat, the superheated stellar matter expands with catastrophic immediacy. There is no slow degradation, only an instantaneous apocalyptic breach where the fury of a newborn star is unleashed into a confined space, obliterating matter and logic alike. The Loyalists understood the profound finality of the weapon they now primed. They slapped the activation runes, the red lights of the detonators blinking in unison with the failing hearts of the weary warriors. Surrounded by a ceaseless sea of screaming nightmares, the last standing sons of the Emperor formed a final defensive ring around the primed explosives. They raised their chainswords and emptied their final magazines into the encroaching darkness, welcoming the inevitable embrace of martyrdom. The countdown timers reached their terminal 0, and the melter charges purged their devastating payload into the invisible cages holding back the captive sun. The melter charges detonate with the precision of an executioner's blade. The sheer heat of the blasts instantly severs the primary magnetic containment fields holding the raging heart of the Dies Irae in check. For a single agonizing heartbeat, time itself seems to slow across the bleeding trenches of Hydra Cordatus. The artificial sun, trapped within the chest of the corrupted Imperator Titan, slips its ancient leash. Superheated plasma surges outward, no longer bound by the sacred wards and arcane machinery originally forged by the Martian priesthood. It is a slow, methodical death from within. The titanic plasma reactor goes totally critical, its blinding white fury eating outward through thick layers of cursed plasteel, void shield generators, and reinforced adamantium. Vast, cathedral-like corridors of rusted iron, filled with blasphemous shrines and traitorous crewmen, are vaporized into nothingness in a fraction of a second. The flesh of the heretics is burned away so utterly that not even ash remains. As the cleansing fire of the reactor reaches the deeply corrupted core of the god machine, the massive demonic entity bound to its colossal frame realizes its sudden doom. The Dies Irae unleashes a psychic death scream, a howling shockwave of pure immaterium agony that transcends the limits of mere physical sound. This unnatural wail ripples violently across the atmosphere of the planet. It shatters every remaining pane of glass for hundreds of miles, rupturing the eardrums of every mortal soldier and forcing mighty space marines to their knees in sudden, blinding vertigo. To witness the catastrophic meltdown of an Imperator Titan is to gaze upon the unbridled wrath of the cosmos itself. When a plasma reactor of this immense magnitude breaches its final housing, The ensuing thermal detonation creates an immediate vaporization zone spanning several kilometers in every direction. Nothing physical or spiritual can survive the initial flashpoint. Beyond this searing epicenter, a concussive radioactive firestorm expands with relentless, terrifying fury. This shockwave scours the earth of all organic matter, instantly rendering heavily fortified bastions and deep trench networks into pools of bubbling molten slag. The environmental devastation left in the wake of such a death is absolute and eternal. The soil is permanently glassed by the tremendous heat, fused into a blackened, jagged mirror that will forever radiate lethal doses of poisonous, unseen energies. Centuries after the final fires fade into embers, the irradiated ash will continue to choke the atmosphere of the world, guaranteeing the land remains a cursed, uninhabitable wasteland where life can never again take root. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, the ruined, hollowed carcass of the Dies Irae finally surrenders to the pull of gravity. Its towering, fortress-like legs, which once crushed entire loyalist regiments beneath their indomitable tread, buckle and violently snap under the catastrophic weight of the dying god. Tens of thousands of tons of burning adamantium, twisted by impossible heat and ancient heresy, plummet toward the scarred earth. The colossal impact violently shakes the deep tectonic plates of Hydra Cordatus. It throws up a titanic, suffocating plume of blinding fire, vaporized rock, and churning black smoke. It is a funeral pyre of unmatched cinematic glory and unspeakable horror, marking the violent end of a nightmare that had plagued the loyal subjects of the Emperor for 10 long millennia. The dark smoke begins to slowly drift across the shattered plains, raining hot metal over the silent, burning graveyard that waits below. The dust settled over the broken spine of the Dies Irae. For 10,000 years, this engine of heresy had walked the stars, casting a shadow of absolute ruin over loyalist worlds. Now it was nothing more than a burning carcass of twisted adamantium and dying reactor fire. To the exhausted defenders of Hydra Cordatus, looking up at the fallen god of iron, it felt as though a great and terrible curse had finally been lifted from the galaxy. They had achieved the impossible. They had slain the beast that breached the walls of the imperial palace. Yet in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, triumph is rarely more than an illusion painted in the blood of martyrs. The death of the Titan was a monumental feat of heroism, but it was a victory entirely devoid of salvation. While the eyes of the defenders were fixed upon the apocalyptic death throes of the Emperor Titan, the true doom of Hydra Cordatus was already sealed. The Iron Warriors are masters of siegecraft, possessing a cold and ruthless pragmatism that views even the mightiest god machines as expendable assets. The Dies Irae, with all its legendary infamy, was merely a grand distraction. The warsmith had used the immense slaughter caused by the Titan to blind the Imperial defenders to his true objective. Deep beneath the battered surface of the fortress, in the highly classified subterranean vaults, the ultimate prize lay completely undefended. The Iron Warriors did not come to Hydra Cordatus for mere conquest or the glory of slaughter. They came for the massive tithe of harvested gene seed, a priceless genetic bounty meant to secure the future of the Adeptus Astartes. While the Loyalists celebrated the death of a single machine, the Iron Warriors breached the sacred cryocrypts and stole the fortress fell. Every sacrifice made to bring down the Dies Irae was rendered utterly meaningless in the face of this catastrophic strategic defeat. This is the bitter reality of the Imperium of Man, a decaying stellar empire where monumental sacrifices often fail to halt the grinding wheel of decay. The blood of heroes buys nothing but a few more seconds on a clock counting down to extinction. 1,000 brave souls can lay down their lives to slay a monster, only to find that the monster was merely the vanguard of a much deeper betrayal. To kill a legend is not enough to win a war. The Iron Warriors secured their vile harvest and left Hydra Cordatus a graveyard of ash and stolen hope. The defenders had traded their lives, their fortress, and their most sacred genetic relics just to destroy a single weapon in the arsenal of the ruinous powers. The carcass of the Dies Irae would rot upon a conquered world, a monument to a hollow triumph that only hastened the doom of mankind. The beast was dead, but the wolves had already torn out the throat of the prey. The siege of Hydra Cordatus ended not in righteous salvation, but in bitter ruin. Though the beast was finally slain, the Iron Warriors still claimed their dark prize from the ashes. The imperious defenders were slaughtered, their sacrifice rendered hollow by the sheer malice of the galaxy. Left behind on that desolate, wind-scoured world is a monument to the ultimate failure of mankind. The carcass of the Dies Irae rests where it fell, a rusted mountain of shame bleeding toxic tears into the poisoned earth. It is a corpse of god-machine and history alike. The howling winds of Hydra Cordatus strip away its blistered paint, revealing the rotting adamantium beneath. It is a pitiful end for the greatest engine of war ever conceived by mortal minds. Once this mighty Imperator Titan was the very manifestation of the Emperor's grand vision. It was the zenith of the Omnissiah's craft, a walking cathedral meant to shepherd humanity into an age of enlightened conquest. It was the promise of the Great Crusade forged in steel and fury. Instead, it became the ultimate avatar of our collective hubris. When the Warmaster turned his face from the light, the Dies Irae followed, willingly plunging into the abyss of treason. For 10,000 years, it stalked the stars as a shadow of what the Imperium could have been. It serves as a grim reminder that perfection is an illusion in this fallen universe. Every sacred mechanism and blessed cog was twisted by the warp, proving that no armor is thick enough to repel the rot of the soul. There is a tragic, inescapable truth woven into the very fabric of our endless war. The things mankind builds to save itself will ultimately be the things that destroy it. We forge titans to defend our worlds, only to watch them burn our cities to ash. We engineer flawless warriors to unite the stars, only to see them butcher half the galaxy in the name of dark gods. The Dies Irae is the physical embodiment of this inescapable paradox. In our desperate bid for survival, we create the instruments of our own annihilation. We reach for salvation and grasp only the blade that will sever our own throats. In the grim darkness of the far future, mankind's greatest enemy is always itself. The Xenos and the mutant may gnaw at the borders of our dying realm, but it is the treason in human hearts that strikes the fatal blow. The galaxy churns ever onward, entirely oblivious to the tragic history of the rusted metal mountain on Hydra Cordatus. New wars are sparked in a million systems, feeding the insatiable hunger of a universe that knows only slaughter. The glorious days of the Great Crusade are nothing more than myth, suffocated beneath 10 millennia of dogma, ignorance, and decay. The Dies Irae is dead, yet the doom it heralded continues to unfold. We are a species lingering in the twilight, fighting a war we lost 10,000 years ago. As the fires of the Imperium slowly burn down to embers, the rotting hulk of the Day of Wrath stands as a tombstone for humanity. It is the epitaph of a golden age that destroyed itself, leaving only shadows and dust in the cold void.